Welcome to SportsLit. I'm Neil Acharya.
And I am Nathan Sager.
Today we welcome John Shannon to discuss Evolve or Die, Hard-Won Lessons from a Hockey Life. Published by Simon & Schuster Canada and Shannon Sports Media. It was released on October 25th, 2022. John Shannon has officially been working in sports broadcasting for 45 years and counting. In that time, he heavily influenced the institution known as Hockey Night in Canada. He started as a production assistant in 1977 and rose to producing the games from Western Canada. And those were the years of Wayne Gretzky and the high-flying Oilers in their heyday and the Battle of Alberta. That first stint lasted until 1986. He returned to the program as executive producer in 1994 and held the role until 2000. For the average fan, the producer isn't someone you really think of or know about, but they run the show behind the scenes. They decide what you will see and how you will see it. They carry the weight.
Yes, and what's notable about John Shannon's tenures, neither of which lasted 10 years exactly at Hockey Night in Canada, was he came when they were in that period, like the needle, tends to be flat, and then it will go up and down like a seismograph. And that was what happened in Hockey Night in Canada both times he was there in that late 70s through mid 80s period. That's when sports on television is starting to explode. That's when ESPN is going on the air in the States. That's when TSN is launching in Canada, and that's also when Hockey Night in Canada is challenged to go from outside the Toronto, Montreal corridor in central Canada to welcoming in the West with 4 new teams coming in, as you mentioned, Neil. And John Shannon, as a Westerner, guy who grew up in BC, didn't actually know that about him. Was part of that in those wild and woolly days. And then when he came back, for a second go around, in the mid 90s, that was when they also had to scale up the show again to a standard Saturday night double header instead of just one game at 8 o'clock local time. And then they were building in a journalism piece with the satellite hot stove segments, which of course we explored in our Al Strachan episode in 2020, season 4, episode 11. And so that's a little 411 on Mr. Shannon, who has 20/20 vision about what hockey should look like on TV.
That's right, Nate. Season 4, episode 11, as you said. And Shannon has also won a Sports Emmy for Outstanding Live Sports Special for the 2002 Salt Lake City Olympics coverage with NBC. He was an NHL Executive VP of Broadcasting in 2008-09. Then he spent a decade at Sportsnet as a commentator for their hockey coverage and partnered with Bob McCown at Primetime Sports. They have since transported their talents to the podcast world around 2020 when McCown was laid off or fired. No, I think he was laid off from Rogers. And have since been appearing on Sirius XM. Shannon has the rare distinction of being, I think it was a buyout actually. Shannon has the rare distinction of being the first sports producer that I know of to move from behind the camera to a role in front of it. A part of his evolution in this ruthless industry, there's that theme of evolution, evolve or die. He explains the roots of this move in his book, and we'll talk about that with him during our interview.
In reading the book, you get a sense of where he's coming from, in coming to make television. Anyone who I think makes TV or makes any sort of, creative product, they start out as an aficionado, scholar of the medium or scholar of the genre, even if those aren't the terms they would self-apply now, let alone when they're that kid falling in complete thrall with it. The type who doesn't watch a game to see who wins. I mean, they're interested in that, obviously, but they're also taking note of, the presentation and how to build, the dramatic effect. Neil, every sports person we know has done this. I think when you were a kid, you took, an empty pop can and you would hold it in front of yourself like a microphone, and you would call the play-by-play off the TV. And of course, in my case, then my dad would be like, most kids who like sports go and play them outside.
But you digress.
Yeah, why can't you do anything like a normal person?
Well, I've asked myself that a lot about you, Nate. But anyway, continue.
Yeah, and John also says, we don't hold grudges, Neil, just only against each other, right? Shannon likely, he had that similar experience, and he writes about in the book, growing up in, 1960s British Columbia, learning his sports through the radio, listening, all-time play-by-play greats, two of whom I think are topical, somewhat topical, because one was Vin Scully calling Dodgers games, and Vin's energy just returned to the earth this past summer. Another, of course, was the great Lakers announcer Chick Hearn, who's depicted in the Winning Time HBO series, which is based on a book by another one of our guests from 2020, Jeff Pearlman. And he also mentions a guy who's not as well known, but probably should have had a biopic, a guy named Bill King, who is in Oakland. His book summons up something else I read. John's book, of course, summons up something else I read recently. This line, I won't say where I found it. Fear kills more dreams than failure ever will. And that sort of, makes this book a little bit inspirational, although that's not where you're going to find it in your bookstore. Like everyone who's worked in broadcasting as long as John has they've been part of things that, where they had the right idea, but didn't have, the right financing, or, they had the financing, but the execution didn't work out. So he's, experienced failure, but obviously, someone who's had the career he has is not become fearful. And like they say, Neil, if you never take a chance, you never have a chance.
And you never innovate, which is a big hallmark of a great TV producer. And John has done that and did that with Hockey Night and elsewhere. And John, Evolve or Die, remember, as the title of this book, was let go by Rogers in a cost-cutting move, one of many that'll still come. And that was in July of 2019. So it was another evolution that had to take place, and he jumped into a role as the managing editor of CBC's hockey coverage for Beijing 2022. In this role, he guided editorial I'm not going to use that word. I hate the word content. He just guided the editorial direction of what we were seeing on air, and worked very closely with a fresh crop of on-air hosts and analysts. Being back at CBC for that was another homecoming of sorts. Remember, he had two different stints at Hockey Night in Canada. He is referred to Hockey Night in Canada as Team Blue. There's two teams playing on the ice, and there's Team Blue, which is another team broadcasting that action. And he says that's part of his family. He's fully vested in that institution, in the institution that was, and he still holds that connection very close to his heart. Just like he holds his family's. It's family. It's family.
Indeed, and that's a connection, Canadians, felt for generations. We have a lot of, what I call emotional equity in these hockey telecasts that are, after all, owned by a couple of mega corporations with the express written consent of the National Hockey League. But that's something that, it originates from deep in the culture in a way that doesn't happen with other sports properties in this country. I don't think it's quite like that with the way Americans relate to the, whoever puts on the games they watch. That's why, to this day, even with the bajillion-dollar Sportsnet deal, there's still an inventory of games on CBC free-to-view platforms at a time when major live sports aren't just all on cable. They're now starting to leave cable for streaming services.
Yeah, the listeners our listeners that may wonder why, because we cover the wide gamut of sports and try and keep it very broad, not focus on one thing. They may wonder why so many Canadians care about Hockey Night in Canada enough to where they'd want to read a book about what happens behind the scenes, or at least a large part of a book that describes what happened behind the scenes and the politics. That's a very fair question. It's a question we asked a previous guest, David Schultz.
Yeah, season 2, episode 5, back in 2018, when we were, passing a microphone around in an edit suite at the Toronto Reference Library.
And don't forget, by the way, folks, go to our website, sportslit.ca, and you can listen to all these past episodes. That's why we shout them out by season and episode. And you can also buy the books on our website. How's that for a plug? Anyway, back to Dave Schultz. He smartly described this connection Canadians have and their interest in Hockey Night in Canada, all aspects of Hockey Night in Canada. He smartly used an outsider's perspective, and that was an American named John Collins. He's the NHL's, I think he's gone now, but he's the NHL's chief marketing officer, who said that the closest thing he could compare Hockey Night in Canada to for stateside was Monday Night Football, and he said that comparison isn't even the right comparison to make because the connection isn't there in the same way. There's no familial element. Monday Night Football is a go grab beers with your buddies on a Monday type thing, not everyone gather around the hearth, the TV, as it were, and watch hockey. And the longevity also of Hockey Night in Canada is, it's been around forever. If you go back to TV in the 50s and then radio before that, so it has longevity. Anyway, I digress. In Canada, yes, we have a little bit of a risk-averse business culture, and that may extend to publishing. So you're not going to see as many books on the shelves about soccer and basketball as you are about hockey. But what I can say, given that kind of, I guess, handicap, if you'll call it, the advantage for a hockey book to sell, even with SportsLit, where we've covered the gamut, and a lot of different types of hockey books, whether it's bios or subjects like Hockey Night in Canada, the highest numbers we've seen. And we're not about numbers. We don't care about numbers. We just care about good conversation and intelligent conversation and fair and balanced conversation. The highest numbers we've seen have a direct connection with Hockey Night in Canada. And that's Al Strachan's book on the hot stove. It's called Hot Stove, actually, about satellite hot stove. Brian McFarlane's Canada host Brian McFarlane's book, A Hell of a Life in Hockey. So there is a deep interest, and that's just reiterating it. Back to John Strachan, a journalist who was part of Satellite Hot Stove, as you say, Nate, says his time at Hockey Night in Canada was divided into two categories. Quote, the period that John Shannon was there and the period that he wasn't. To me, the former was by far the better, unquote. So Hockey Night in Canada will be a focus of our conversation, but not the only focus with John. The book title, after all, is Evolve or Die, and Shannon's career is very much alive due to his adaptability. So coming up, John Shannon, Evolve or Die, Hard-Won Lessons from a Hockey Life. Simon & Schuster is the publisher and Shannon Sports Media, and it was released on October 25th, 2022. And we're back with John Shannon, who we teed up off the top. John, as I said, we're going to get right into it. Congratulations on the book. Evolve or Die. So right now, before we get into the great history and all of that, I want to ask you about right now. What is John Shannon currently doing, aside from the Bobcast, which we all know you from doing on Sirius?
Well, it's funny, Neil. When I left Sportsnet 3 years ago, I didn't think there would be much opportunity to do other things, and boy, was I wrong. So in addition to doing the Bob Account podcast daily, which runs on multiple platforms and has really, in the last 18 months, taken off, and something that both Bob and I are very proud of. I teach 2 days a week at the College of Sports Media in Toronto. I teach television production. I joked with Dave Lannis, who runs the school, that perhaps this will be the first textbook that will be used in class. I say that a little tongue-in-cheek. There are a few stories in there that would make some sense for the kids to learn. But and then I still do a lot of radio and television across the country. I do radio and TV in Winnipeg on CJOB and Global. I do radio and TV in Edmonton on the Chorus station in Edmonton, CHED. I do some Sportsnet still for Edmonton Oilers broadcast, and then I do two things in Vancouver on a podcast with Matt Sakaris and Blake Price, and with Rick Dhaliwal and Donnie Taylor as well on TV on Czech out of Victoria. So for a guy who's supposed to be slowing down, I'm not slowing down very much.
Well, I'm glad to hear.
In addition to the book, and the book's kept me going for the last 18 months.
Yeah, well written. We're going to ask you a little bit about that in a moment, and I'm glad that you're busy. I work in TV, and I sometimes have a tough time explaining to people what I do, because when you're behind the scenes, it's tough. So we are going to ask you about what you do in front of the camera and on air, but in your role as producer, how do you explain what a producer does to the average guy on the street?
Well, I'll tell you what. I've been an organizer all my life, whether it was the tackle football game Sunday night at our high school football field, whether it was the Friday night to go into the movies. I've always been a planner and an organizer, and getting people to tag along. And in many ways, and you combine that with, I came from a family of teachers. My mom and dad were both teachers. My two brothers are teachers. I think that there's a combination of being a teacher and being an organizer, is that's what a producer does. The other metaphor I use, and before the end of the show, you're going to know how many metaphors I do use. The other metaphor I use is I look at a bicycle tire, and I look at the hub of the bicycle tire is the director who's in charge of the pictures, and the announcers are the rubber tire on the outside, and the spokes are the producer. And the spokes keep the director and the announcers turning at the same time. And that's what I do. That's what I did do for the longest time as a producer.
Just touching on being a teacher, and thank you for that description, because not everybody knows, right? After you left Sportsnet, and you jumped on board with CBC during the Olympics,
yep.
And you were managing, I believe the title was managing editor in hockey, right?
That's correct. Yeah. And they didn't want to give me another big title, so we came to the agreement of managing editor.
But looking at the cast that was on for those broadcasts, there was a lot of new faces on the women's side, and then I think her and Ryan on the men's side hosting. How was that? Did that tie into teaching in the truest form and what you've had to do throughout your career? Because it seemed like
a little bit, Neil. It did a little bit, because you're right. We had about 13 commentators, and we had a handful that some had never really been on television before. Others had minimal television experience, or had television experience but not in the roles that they were supposed to be in. And so there was that teaching component to, okay, when you say something, you got to be more descriptive, and you got to be simpler, and you can't have run-on sentences. I always tell people the most important part of a sentence is that period at the end of it, because you know when to stop. And so those are the types of things that we dealt with, particularly early on with Shannon Zabados and Megan Mickelson. And then editorially, with the great commentators we had, it was always a discussion of what was right, what was wrong, what worked, what wouldn't work, and trying to simplify the messaging of what our intermissions and what our openings were supposed to be like. Because I think the other thing that in our business that happens too much is we really make it complicated. And television, quite frankly, isn't that complicated. It's not. You just have to be able to take your time and understand the messages you're trying to deliver, and then figure out how to deliver those messages.
Going to your roots in production, I thought it'd be an interesting thing to ask you, kind of a current example of how you would produce a game. So tonight, and we try to be evergreen here usually, but I'm going to use this example tonight. And by the time people listen to this, it won't be tonight. But the Flyers are visiting the Leafs. Mm-hmm. The Leafs are under fire. There's a story angle with Mitch Marner and Sheldon Keefe and some animosity. There could be a jersey thrown on the ice. I don't know, maybe a waffle. Can you take me through the day of a producer from, the morning and the meeting during or after the morning skate, not during, before or after the morning skate, to when you go on air? What's happening today when this type of, there could be something that erupts potentially?
Today's really, as a game day, today's more of a day of observation more than anything. Most of your planning should have been done the last 2 days. Following the Leafs return from Anaheim, you would have made a first blush at okay, what are the important storylines of what you want to talk about in the opening? The Marner Sheldon issue certainly is something that needs to be addressed. The Leaf start needs to be addressed, and contrastly, you need to deal with John Tortorella and what he's done in Philadelphia and the start that they're off to. They played last night, so you would have a little more flexibility in what you were going to talk about with them. But from that perspective, and the other interesting factor for me, and I love threads. And I describe threads of how you can link two stories together, and that's what those threads do. And if you have 3 or 4 threads through the night, you have to keep asking yourself, did we finish that thread? And before we went on to the other one. The other thread is that Sheldon Keefe played for John Tortorella in Tampa for a brief time. They both went their separate ways. And so from that perspective, there's enough content to deal with the issues at hand, the impatience of the Maple Leaf fans, the impatience of John Tortorella. Yeah, and then you just have to find a simple way to communicate that. Perhaps it is a word of impatience. Perhaps it is a word of demand. Is the demand of the Leaf fan as much as the demand of John Tortorella? Try to find some linkage that makes it understandable for the viewer to go, hey, that's kind of cool. I understand now what we're watching.
Very nice. Go ahead, Nate.
Yeah, and I recently heard you say, John, I think the quote was, I don't believe very much in compromising what is right for the television that I produce. Yeah. I just wondered, because there's people who can take things so many ways. How much of that was sort of personal credo, and what part might have been a bit of a confession?
Well, aren't they both the same? A personal credo and a confession?
A little.
Nate, I would tell you that not compromising kept getting me in trouble along the way. But I believed in what I believed. Understand, and then you also, and this was tougher when I was much younger. I was much younger. Understand that I was I was a child when I started to produce. I happened to be at the right place at the right time as the NHL grew from 17 to 21 teams, and the list of producers of hockey on television in our country you could do on one hand. And they needed more bodies. We added 4 teams, and they actually added a 5th team when you think Calgary, if you want to put it that way, when Calgary became the Flames there after leaving Atlanta. So there was so much work, and they had bodies to fill. And I volunteered to fill that void. And so when you're 22 or 23 years old, you're full of piss and vinegar, and you think you know what's right, and you also think that I'm not going to be a pushover, and people aren't going to boss me around, and I know what I'm doing, and so don't tell me what to do. I'm just going to do it, like every 22-year-old does now. And so I lived that, and there are times it got me in trouble, and there are times it didn't. And then when the times it didn't get me in trouble, people would say, "Wow, that was brilliant. I've never thought of it that way. That was quite something." And given the license to do it, it worked out very well for my career from that perspective.
Yeah, there's an incredible story in the book. Maybe you can let the listener in on. Of course, we want them to buy the book, but there's literally 1,000 stories like this in the book. You were around that age, maybe a little in your 20s, and you sort of had to tell Bobby Hull that he wasn't too any great shakes as an analyst, to put it mildly.
Yeah, there's an overarching theme of that. And actually that night, because I don't want to go into the detail of the story, because I think it's a good story to tell, it's one that the reader will enjoy. But quite frankly, it taught me as a producer that I have to over prepare. Because what if I deal with commentators that don't prepare or don't have the passion that I have? And I think that probably bothered me more than anything, Nate, was that why didn't Bobby Hull have the same passion for hockey that I did? And I still think that. I said, why these guys that played the game, because they've lived it and it's been so much part of their DNA. I think there are days that I still have more passion for the game than they do. And it's fascinating to think of that. But the Hull one was, and I could, this guy was a legend. This guy was, when I was a kid, I still remember getting his autograph at a celebrity hockey game in Kelowna, BC, and it was an important day in my life. I think I might still have the program. But I was so mad at him, and I under no uncertain terms, and I had to tell him, and I did. I was right in my judgment of him, but that didn't stop my boss from giving me hell for doing it. So it's one of those things. It was a good learning day.
I bet, of course, Bobby Hull, one of the great wings of all time, the guy at the slap shot. I think he tallied up the NHL and WHA goals. He had over 900. And just to speak to his stature in Canada, when my mom had knee replacement surgery a few years ago, we had my mother in an episode recently. I got her a Bobby Hull signed picture from the hospital as a fundraiser for the hospital that did it. John, you talk about threads, and I guess one really big one, and you're our first Canadian media guest since Scott Morrison back in the season premiere, so you kind of have to get called in for the bullpen with the bases loaded for this question. Big thread in Canadian sports media the last, I guess, few months was, Kyle Beach coming forward about his abuse, the abuse he suffered in Chicago in the NHL, Rick Westhead helping him tell his story, and then the Hockey Canada scandal, which Rick Westhead and Katie Strang from The Athletic broke. One of the aftershocks of that was just to see this, heavy-hitting investigative journalism that affected, the network, TSN's, client relationships. But how much does that really show how much having the journalistic piece really adds value in sports broadcasting, adds something for the fan?
You're assuming that I agree with you?
Well, I mean, I'm saying how. That doesn't assume agreement.
The difficult part becomes, and listen, the Beach story, horrendous, needed to be told. The Hockey Canada issues and transparency needed to be told. There's no question that I'm not doubting what went on and how they were covered. But not for a single day would I ever suggest that I'm a journalist. I've never been a journalist. The moment that I decide that I want to cover a hockey game, and then I pay for the right to cover that hockey game, I'm no longer a journalist. I'm a partner.
Okay.
I'm a partner. And so that becomes a major issue. And you walk a very tight line, and you walk a tight line sometimes that you do piss off your partner. And there are times you need to tell the story. I felt that through other issues, through other times, the discussion that went on and goes on in sports, period, and leagues. You have to be able to create a bit of a perception that you're journalists, but in essence, you're not. There are times that, the league or the network will push back one way or the other, and they have to tell a story. I think the best one to my mind in that ilk was everything that happened in and around Colin Kaepernick, where, the league was certainly not pro Colin Kaepernick, but in the end, the networks found the obligation to have to tell a bit of the story and at least show the anthems for what that 2-year period in the National Football League, when players did or didn't kneel over Kaepernick's situation and what Kaepernick stood for. So it's never simple. It's not as simple as, well, that's journalism and that's it. Well, it's just not that way. And people don't have to agree with me. That's fine. That's a reality of the business that we're in. You know, the greatest and biggest sporting event on an annual basis or a regular basis are the Olympics. There's no more controlled event than the Olympics when it comes to what kind of pictures are used, what kind of stories are told, how controversial things can be. So I think that journalism certainly has a place to play, particularly when, in the end, there are lots of issues that need to be discussed, like the beach one, and like the Hockey Canada issue. And they have a place to play in there. But on a regular day-to-day basis, I think it's silly for people to think that, well, the guys around the game of hockey are journalists, and they're going to disagree with me. But I just, their job is to help you enjoy and grow the game, because they want you to come back and watch the game again the next night, and as opposed to, well, working in the negative consistently. Listen, I have lots of friends that disagree with Dave Hodge, and I disagree with this all the time. We're great friends, and the difference between journalism and arena rights holder is sometimes a fine line.
And there's also go ahead, Neil.
Yeah, and I quickly, before Neil asks a question, I think Dan Jenkins was one of the greatest sports writers there ever was. I think he voiced something similar. That there is the journalism, and there are people who with the rights holder are, I guess, a little bit with the establishment. I'll think of the exact quote later.
Well, but Dan Jenkins had the great luxury of working for a company that was independent of any event that he covered.
Yeah.
I mean, he worked for Sports Illustrated for all those years, and Sports Illustrated was given access. They didn't have to buy access.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an even bigger topic than too.
It's a major issue. I mean, like we talk about, like, sports broadcasting. Look at baseball as an example. How many baseball announcers are employees of the club?
I don't know.
Are there any less that aren't?
I would suggest most of them are.
Yeah.
So you really have to judge, and so how did, for instance, and I don't know the answer, but I'm going to ask the question anyway. How did the Houston Astros announcers cover the gambling scandal? Or the cheating scandal? How did they, not gambling, but cheating, how did they cover the cheating scandal? I don't know.
Right. Nate,
it's
you might know
one.
that.
They had, it was kind of like acknowledge it once at the start of the broadcast, early in the broadcast, and then just sort of let it go into the ether.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That does happen.
Yeah, I think there's also, I mean, listen, I think in our day and age, with just like everyone can do, journalism is an art, right? So everyone can partake and do it if you have a blog now, or you have Twitter. There's a whole separate thing on.
But Neil, journalism. There's a code of conduct for journalism too.
Right.
So having a blog, it doesn't make you a journalist.
Right, but you can do journalistic work because it's an art, and you can't be an engineer, right? You can't try to build a bridge, but you can try and write an article.
But but you have to be. There's some training to become a good journalist.
Agreed. I think me and Nate know about that.
Yeah, you do, but not. But there's lots of people out there that don't understand that.
Right. Yeah, and
don't understand that, and because the lines have become so blurred.
Exactly. Over
the years. I mean, not just in sports, but in politics.
Yes.
The lines are blurred so badly. So it's a difficult one to get your head wrapped around at times.
I agree, and I think what Rick does is he's an investigative journalist, which is a little bit different from, let's say, what Elliot Friedman, which is kind of a bit of an investigative journal, but he's not, uncovering. He's finding out information in a different way, which is different from what David Amber does, which is, hosting. So I think that the general public doesn't know how these lines exist, and it's even more confusing now with everything being blurred, as you say. So speaking of blurred lines, just going down my list of questions here, your second stint at Hockey Night starts right around the time Gary Bettman takes over the NHL, just a year or two after. I think it's a year after.
Yeah, now, he took over February of '93. So.
Right. In '94, you started again, right, at Hockey as the executive producer.
Yeah.
So, I mean, did you see a difference from your... I know you had a different role the second time around, a much bigger role, but did you see a difference? There's a quote in the book where you say, it's after you're talking about Don Cherry, but this applies to the whole show. It says Hockey Night could promote and protect Canadian-style hockey and buffer it from big business, brackets, particularly American big business, and keep it real and keep it ours. Did that become increasingly harder when Gary took over?
No, because the contract that we had allowed us to do that. It said in no uncertain terms we had editorial control. They had no role in approving announcers. They had no role in approving content. The CBC, as is the CBC want to do, feels it needs to create some level of production integrity. Did at that point. So I really did view. I viewed it the first time around when I was there too, but I certainly when I came back as executive producer, I viewed the show as a gatekeeper in so many ways, because even from a branding perspective, Neil, if you put the stick in the puck, the original Hockey Night logo in 1994 when I was there, and you put the NHL shield beside it, there were lots of people that say they liked the Hockey Night in Canada logo and understood what Hockey Night in Canada stood for more than the NHL logo did. And in fact, when I went to the league and worked for the league in the early 2000s, we did a brand exercise, and the brand exercise put the NHL shield about 8 or 9 on the list of brands and logos viewed by Canadians as being important. And I think that was an eye-opener to many of my friends in New York City at that point. But we were able to, because we were Hockey Night in Canada, because we had a history that we were proud of, and we had already created some level of production integrity. We stood apart from the league at times when we needed to stand apart. And we then felt we could be critical of the league, and we wanted to ensure that Hockey Night in Canada remained Hockey Night in Canada. We weren't interested in Hockey Night in San Jose or Hockey Night in Dallas. We wanted to make sure that, at one point we had 8 member clubs in Canada in that tenure, and we wanted to try to make sure that we could protect Canadians and watching the game the way Canadians like to watch the game. And I think that was important.
Does that exist anymore?
It would be incorrect for me to answer that, because I'm not party to that. What I can tell you was that when I moved to the league, in 2006, after working for the Maple Leafs, mm-hmm. I worked there for another 4 or 5 years. A lot of the secret sauce that we had at Hockey Night became league philosophy. Mm-hmm. But because what it did do was help us grow television production and television philosophy in the United States. And so we ran seminars and we ran production theory meetings, and we were hands-on with all the regional rights holders to say, okay, here's what our expectation is. We created a library of content that we gave them with the interest that it wasn't necessarily supposed to be an advertorial for the National Hockey League, but it was in the best interest of what was good hockey television production. So a lot of those secrets that existed in 1994 and 95 at CBC and Hockey Night got transferred to the NHL and the member clubs in the United States, particularly in 2005 to 2010.
So before I let Nate jump in, and we're going to go back a little bit, thank you for that, John. There's a kid line in NHL history And apparently there, and that's of course with the old Leafs. I think it's Charlie Conacher, Joe Primo, and Busher Jackson. I think
Sure.
Busher Jackson. I've heard about a kid line under Ralph Mellenby at Hockey Night in Canada. Does that ring a bell?
Well, not only did we work together, we lived together, and we went to university together, and that we met at what was then called Ryerson, in the radio and television department, and Doug B. Forth, who ended up being the president of Rogers Sportsnet, Rick Briggs-Jude, who ended up being a senior production person at both TSN and at Sportsnet, and I were the 19 and 20-year-old young guns bouncing around the walls of the Hockey Night in Canada office Monday to Friday, and then going and doing games Saturday and national games on Wednesday. And so it was really a blessing. We were identified early in our careers that these guys were going to be the future of the show, and we were trained that way. We were trained to be the next producers and executive producers, and we were going to carry on the tradition of what became Hockey Night in Canada.
And that was it Ralph that identified you guys?
No, it was a group of guys. I would actually give somebody by the name of Bob Gordon, who was a longtime producer and did most of the Maple Leaf games. He was one rung below Ralph, and he was more hands-on. But he was the one who really identified Doug first, then Rick, and then me as the third one, and of somebody that he wanted around. And then obviously he worked for Ralph, so we had contact with Ralph, and then I was blessed because Ralph and I were kind of cut out of the same cloth, and Ralph and I we battled daily, but we also had a passion to do it right, and he understood that of me, and I understood that of him.
Do you think? I mean, I've come up, in sports TV, and I look around me, and do you think that could ever happen again? Because I don't see a lot of 22-year-olds. Well, usually they're on the row, clipping highlights, or they're running, they're grabbing coffees and stuff, hoping at one point they can. And that could be a generational thing. Maybe the generation behind me is now there's that gap. A lot of things play into that. But I know for my generation, it seemed like you had to sell the farm to even walk in the door.
I truly believe it was right place at right time. It was coincidence more than anything, and it was when sports was exploding, television was on the verge of exploding. I mean, ESPN had started in the late 70s. TSN was coming in 1984. There were other cable channels that were going to carry hockey at that period of time, and so truly, and we were cheap. We worked cheap. So, young, eager, cheap. Boy, oh boy. That's a good equation to have people around. And we had a passion. And we knew the game. I remember sitting one night with Dick Irvin in the client room at Maple Leaf Gardens, which is a little alcove beside the studio. And we went toe-to-toe with trivia. And NHL trivia. And Dick Irvin's a legend. Still is a legend in my mind. Always will be. Right. And we went toe-to-toe for trivia, and I almost beat him. And at one and Dick just turned and said, "Boy, kid, you're good." And that meant something. And so I knew at that point I was on the right track.
One story, one thing you mentioned in passing reference from that period, John, was that you and your classmates, you guys produced a Vanier Cup broadcast in Toronto.
Yeah.
I'm picturing Neil and I. That's actually the first thing we ever did together was university football.
True.
What was that like with the technology you would have been working with? And it's late November, so it's probably not the nicest day. There's no Dome Stadium in 1976 or 77.
Varsity Stadium was sat around 20,000 people, but there was no such thing as wireless microphones then, and we had two headset microphones, and we needed a sideline reporter. So we actually, the night before the Vanier Cup, we had got permission from the school to take 1,000 feet of microphone cable and we strung. Here we are, 3 guys. I mean, we're, teenagers. We're stringing microphone cable through Varsity Stadium to our broadcast position in order for Rick Briggs dude to be our sideline reporter. And so Doug did the play-by-play. I think I did the color, and Rick was our guy on the sidelines. And we were just having fun. We loved it. It was, we did it because we could, and we did it because we wanted to be part of the business so bad. There wasn't nobody could, and nobody. If you asked people, that was the other difference, guys. In those days, if you asked people, could we do that? Everybody said yes. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead. Yeah, sure. Yeah, if you can do it, go ahead. There was no, well, you have to get permission from so and so, and we have to pay for rights, and we have to do. Yeah, go ahead. And that was really exciting. We were, again, timing was so relevant to our early success.
And moving, it's funny when you mentioned that. As Nate mentioned, I kind of forgotten a lot about the stuff we did for youth sports. But you do mention that just having that student card and having the wherewithal of having that student card to get access really helped you back then, right? Get meetings with people and insight, right?
Well, I do the students that I talk to today. It's because there's a real gap. Right now, there's a real gap between the media world and then the sports world. I don't know why it's happened. Whether it's just the protection of the athletes, the buildings that are the way they're built now. You don't have access to people.
Right.
But I viewed my student card as a ticket to everything. And I had to do a radio documentary, and you could choose your own radio documentary topic. And I chose the future of the Canadian Football League. I love the CFL. And so I said, well, heck, I'm in Toronto. I better phone the commissioner. So I go into the phone book. Canadian Football League, 11 King Street West. And there's the phone number. I dial the phone. Canadian Football League. Yes, could I have Jake Goddard, please? Who's speaking? It's John Shannon from Ryerson. Just a minute, sir. Boom. Pick up the phone. Jake Goddard. Mr. Goddard, my name is John Shannon. I think I said Jake. That's my son's name. It's John Shannon from Ryerson. I'm a student. I'm doing a documentary on the future of the CFL. Could I come and talk to you? I'm available tomorrow at 2:00. I get on the subway. I have a huge, massive reel-to-reel tape machine that I don't even know how it works. And I'm lugging it on the subway and lug it down to King Street up to the 11th floor. And there I am with Jake Goddard. And I realized that day that I'll just phone people. I'll just talk to them. And so that's all I did. I phoned Bill Stevenson. I phoned Johnny Esau. Everybody in our industry that I could talk to, I phoned just to see if I could, get a step ahead. Whether it was when the Vancouver Canucks were in town, I'd phone the hotel and ask for Jim Robson. That's what I did. And there are some of those guys that are still alive today that they turn like, remember when you called me when you were 19 years old? I said, oh yeah. How could I forget? You took the call. So.
It is interesting too, and having the, I guess the wherewithal to use that. And I do find now, well, even myself sometimes I'm like, if I'm writing a script or something, I'm reluctant to call someone. I'm like, why am I not calling this person right now and finding out what I need to have in the script? It's almost a self-policing that's gone on, and I think it is because we're almost programmed to think we have to go through a certain channel or we're going to get in trouble from our own company or from the other side. But again, I think that comes down to just journalistic instinct.
Well, I've never been a journalist in my life. So what I would tell you, though, is I think there's a layer of laziness in all of it, because what happens is that I say, I say it to my kids. So I gave you a number. Did you talk to him? Well, I texted him. What do you mean you texted him? He doesn't know who you are.
Right.
There's no value in a text. Pick the phone up and call him. And a text is for after the fact. A text is for, learning protocols. And I do sound like an old man, I know, but learning protocols of communication are so important in everything we do. After all, we are in the communications industry, and we just sometimes don't know how to communicate.
It's a good point. It's a good point. It reminds me, actually, I mean, I want to get into some of the questions, but now I feel like I want to just tell some stories too. But I did have a good story about Gord Cutler with that, where I just walked in and asked him something once, and it turned out to be very beneficial for me, as opposed to like waiting or not asking. So I'll tell you that later. But
I've hired people. I've hired people at places because of their persistence, not because of their talent,
right,
but because of their persistence.
Sure, yeah, I agree. I mean, and that's a great lesson for anyone listening right now, that especially is probably, younger or new to the industry, or maybe one of your students, or people maybe even still in the industry that are not willing to maybe go into that office and ask. So listen, this is a very harsh industry, and I mean the book title "Evolve or Die" lends itself to that. And there's hard-won lessons, I believe, is what the subtitle is, and this book is a lot of success on your part, and a lot of times when it's been tough and you've had to figure it out, and you have. So there's a quote: learning how to manage one's dismissal should be a life lesson at university. It's a very practical, real skill. Mm-hmm. Explain that to people, because I work in this industry right now, and I know what people say on the best of days, let alone when they get laid off. So explain.
Well, first of all, don't call it laid off. You get fired. Face the reality, you got fired. I've been fired. And there are cycles within being fired, and it's embarrassing. It's embarrassing to be told that you're no longer wanted or no longer good enough to do a job. And how to mentally and physically fight through that is something that I think that it's good for soul searching. What have I done right? What have I done wrong? How would I do things differently? Again, it goes back to Nate's question about compromise. And so I'm a better person for my failures than I am for my successes, because I had to examine what I did wrong, and how do I evolve when I'm given the next chance to be a better boss, a better partner, a better co-worker. And that's what it's all about. And I think it's a generational thing too. My father worked at the same job for 47 years. 47 years. Right. I'm close to 47 years of work now, and have probably had, 10 or 11 jobs.
Right.
I loved every one of them. Never really viewed them as jobs, because but I had to change, and I had to be better, and I had to be more creative, and I had to be open to suggestion. If after running Hockey Night in Canada, if somebody said, well, you're going to be running a tier 2 cable channel involving a single team, how will you react to that? My answer was, well, I can't imagine it, because I was at the top of the hill. Now I'm going to start at the bottom. But it was one of the most fun things I ever did. It was one of the most enjoyable building processes I ever went through with 47 other people. It truly became a watershed mark for how to be creative with no money. You evolved to your environment, and you learned to be better. And in fact, I will tell you right now, I've used the slogan "Evolve or Die" a long time. When I speak, you have to evolve, or you whittle away, you disappear, you die. And I really started to learn that when I was at Leafs TV more than any other time, because we had no money. We had tier 2 equipment, but we had enthusiasm, we had passion, we had youthfulness. And so we evolved to be better. And what we did, in many ways, there are things that are still on the air on many channels that got their first tries at Leafs TV. And that told me that people like things like that, and we were better for it.
Similar to in Leafs TV, there's almost an example with the Score. The Score tried a lot of things, before it got absorbed by Rod, that kind of are part of what you see on Sportsnet now. But I mean, an aside too, I think the reaction is kind of what I was leaning towards too. I mean, you talk about a lot of things that when you get let go, you can learn and you can, I guess, absorb new skills and try new things, but just the reaction too, right? Like taking the high ground is super hard. I think you write about that. And I remember actually, I think I started the NHL Network right after you got fired or whatever you want to call it.
I got fired.
And I remember running into you, probably don't remember this, but I ran into you at a Leaf game and I said, I'm at the NHL Network. And you said, oh yeah, I said, well, you said, who'd they bring on? Or maybe you knew. And I said, oh, so-and-so. And he said, oh, they got a good man. Great. And then I was like, man, this guy seems like way too positive about this.
Well,
but
the other thing, Neil, our industry's so small.
Mm.
If you hold a grudge in our industry, you're not going to last very long.
Right.
That's particularly in Canadian media. It's bigger in the United States, but in Canadian media, if you hold a grudge, you're not going to last.
Right. Yeah, no, it's a fair point, I think, and it's one that it's a skill, I think, too. As I said, in our industry where there's so much volatility, I hear a lot of times, so that I think it's a good lesson. Okay, let's switch gears to Don Cherry, and I would say probably synonymous with Hockey Night in Canada as Foster Hewitt. I don't know, maybe more so for this generation. I don't know.
Recency bias, you're correct. Yeah. That's one of my, by the way, that's my favorite slogan in 2022.
Recency bias?
Recency bias.
I like it. It's
true.
a
good one. Because it applies to everything.
Yes, it's true.
It applies to everything. Who is the greatest Oiler of all time? Connor McDavid. Well, recency bias. Wayne Gretzky.
It's true, because me and Nate had this conversation the other day when I was watching the SportsCenter Top 10, and somehow they had the World Series of 1992 as number 3 and the Bautista bat flip as number 2. And I was like, Nate, I don't know if a bat flip in a divisional series can trump a World Series, but somehow I think it was a recency bias myself.
Yeah, there was a bat flip in my apartment when you told me that.
I agree with Neil on this one. But that's the magic and frustration of Toronto sports fans. Right. Jose Bautista and Doug Gilmour, 2 legends. Yeah, never won a championship either of them in Toronto.
No, it's true. It's true. Okay, so I want to ask you again. When I've seen you in the Foster Hewitt gondola, and Coach's Corner used to come on, everyone would get their ice cream and watch the TV, but you would have your back turned to the TV and you'd kind of be staring at the ground listening. Now, is that something that goes back to is that a coincidence, or is that something that went back to like your production days on this? Because, you were the only guy facing the other way.
I wanted to hear every word.
Okay.
I didn't want to be distracted. I wanted to hear every word, listen to every word. I didn't need to see Don one more time. And I say that lovingly. But I wanted to make sure that I listened to every word that was said.
There you go. Nate, go ahead.
Yeah, of course, writing the book and, meant writing about Cherry. How did you work through finding what I thought was a pretty balanced assessment of how it all sort of ended for him, which is, I guess, coming up 3 years I guess the 3rd anniversary of that is coming up this month too.
Yeah.
I don't know if it was balance. I think one of the other underlying stories that or themes or threads that comes through in my book, and I really was in tune to, was loyalty. I think we've forgotten the word a great deal, not just in sports broadcasting, but I think a lot of places. I think we've lost loyalty, right. and so you combine that with when I haven't worked with Don directly in 2 decades. I did spend a lot of time with Don for a couple of reasons. In the first 2 or 3 years of the Rogers deal, as he was trying to feel comfortable and the new management team was trying to feel comfortable, I was a common thread again. So I could sit with Don before the show started while Ron was doing the rest of the show, and we would sit and yak and have a good time and reminisce about old things and storylines. But it would be difficult for me to even in the book, to write about what went on that November 3 years ago, because I wasn't there to be behind the scenes. I don't know what went on. I don't know how it happened. I was a viewer at home too. So I could only talk about Don in terms that I know Don and what Don has done for me, what I have done for Don, and the relationship that we still maintain. And politically, we are at opposite ends of the spectrum. Politically, he's much more to the right than I am. And we can agree to disagree a ton of times, but we still remain friends. And I think that's what I hoped came across in the chapter I wrote about him.
Oh yeah, the loyalty shone through there, and then it was just sort of, a fair assessment of, as to quote from the movie The Damned United, the last two words in every story ever written. Neil? Yeah,
I mean, I think what comes across really well there is Don the person, which is I think Don Cherry as a person comes across really well, and Ken Reed mentioned this on our podcast earlier too. Like, Don Cherry the person is a good guy. He's got a good heart, and you could put that great story in about. I don't want to give too much away, but he comes to your house with Christmas gifts when you're laid off. Yeah. So I think what I would fired. Yeah. What I would say is I would encourage anyone, like most of the people that have really strong opinions of Don Cherry to me are people that don't usually haven't seen every Coach's Corner, or they just kind of know what they know through hearsay. I would encourage them to read this chapter or this portion of the book just to find out who he is as a person. So moving on, Gretzky's last game. I found out about it on Hot Stove, I remember, and we asked Al about this, and I said, how did you let John scoop you on this, Al? But found out about it on the Hot Stove, on the satellite Hot Stove, and I remember our worry at the time was, okay, his last game that we will be able to see will be in Ottawa, and we won't be able to see him play Pittsburgh in New York on the Sunday afternoon. I think it was a Sunday afternoon.
It was, yeah.
Thank you. Could you tell people that don't know about this what happened, how the challenge of getting this on the air when it wasn't even part of your properties at the time, back in 1999?
Well, yeah, you're right. John Davidson went on the air and basically used his hand as a meter and said a week ago Wayne Gretzky was at about a 25 on the meter to retire, and now he's at a 99% to retire. So that was the Saturday before all the events occurred. So Sunday morning I phoned John and I said, listen, are you serious about what you said last night? And he said yes. So I phoned my boss and said, we don't have that game, and it would be a crying shame if Hockey Night in Canada isn't there for Wayne Gretzky's last game in the National Hockey League. We've got to have this game, Alan. This is important. So Alan, to his credit, agreed with me, and we started the process of 5 or 6 days. The Rangers were in Ottawa on the Thursday night, which was a TSN game already, and so we had Saturday night, traditional Saturday night, end of the regular season in Montreal, Toronto from Bell Center in Montreal, and then Sunday we were getting ready for the playoffs, and so it took us 4 days. It took us 2 days to get to the league to agree to let us carry it. We had to pay again for it. We had to pay money to buy the game. It's not just a question of, well, you're the rights holder. You had to buy the game. So we had to figure out that. And then we had to convince the network to give us the airtime to do the game. And that was a bigger issue. And I remember being called to the executive VP's office, and he said, well, you don't know for sure he's going to retire. I said, yes, I do. He says, well, if this is on your head if he doesn't retire. I said, trust me, he's going to retire. We've already seen the plans for the post-game event. He's retiring. It's done. And I truly believe, and we've never talked about this, I truly believe that Slako Klimku, who is that person in charge, phoned Mansbridge. And I think he said, Peter, what do you think? Should we let them have the time? And I think Peter probably weighed in and said, and Peter loves the game of hockey. I think Peter agreed that we should carry the game, and that's how we got the network time, and the league had already agreed to let us do it, and And then we spent 3.5 days working our tails off, building programming in and around who was going to do that, what features existed, how long we would stay on the air. And it was a whirlwind 72 hours to get that done. In addition to trying to get ready for the Stanley Cup playoffs, we're going to start the following Wednesday.
It's funny. I messaged Shirali Najic when I was trying to get some background on our interview today, and he said if you ask him anything, ask him about that game. So I know you call yourself in the book the world's most highest paid spotter.
Floor director. Yeah. So what happened was at MSG, the Madison Square Garden. It was before the renovation. It wasn't the most conducive television building. And the TV mobiles are on street level, and the ice rink is on the 5th floor of the arena. Right. And so communication and connectivity between what's going on in the arena and the truck sometimes are difficult. And I was getting very frustrated halfway through the first period, and I said, "Screw this! I'm going upstairs." So I went upstairs, and we did have a headset installed between the benches, and I stood between the benches, and basically Paul Graham was producing, Shirley was directing, and I was a spotter. I was saying, so and so is, and I being a sports junkie, I recognized everybody in the building, right. And so we had a great line of communication with the three of us, making sure that everything was set in, the right close-ups were there, Janet's moving. My job wasn't to watch the hockey game in the end. My job was to watch the arena. Right. And it made for a really, really a beautiful show for the greatest player to ever play the game.
It's interesting when what I remember from that game from just a fan perspective. I hadn't started working in media yet. I was in university. Is a friend of ours, me and Nate both know, Ben Millage. His dad never had a TV, but he actually went out and bought a TV for that game. Wow. So I think good. Listen, I know you've given us a lot of time. I want to go through a couple of rapid fire type questions, and then we can get you back to where you need to be. I'm sure you're ready to watch some hockey. Did you produce the 1991 NHL All-Star Game?
Remind me.
That was the one in Chicago Stadium.
Oh yeah, no, I did. I was part of. We did the skills and the All-Star. That was for Sports Channel America. After I left Hockey Night the first time, I ended up getting and did 2 years of Global. Then I moved and worked in the United States for 4 years on the Sports Channel America national package, and we did the first skills competitions.
Right.
That was a challenge. And we also did the All-Star Game through the Gulf War that was on Sports Channel and on NBC. Yeah.
That's the one I'm wondering about, because I mean that is an abundance of riches if you were a producer. Like the crowd's going bananas. It's the height of the Gulf War. So do you remember seeing that and choosing shots? Where do I go next? There's sparklers, flags, people are losing their mind.
Because there are those of us that had been in the game. If the Blackhawks were good, that all existed. The Blackhawks, it was crazy then, when Denny Savard was there, and it was crazy. My favorite story there was on NBC was carrying the actual game. The Gulf War was on, and NBC had a philosophy that they didn't carry national anthems.
Oh, okay.
We don't carry national anthems. So, but Sports Channel America was a little less restrictive. So we ran Wayne Mesmer singing the Star Spangled Banner on the Friday night of the All-Star Game, or Saturday, Friday, one of those days, and it was electric in that building. Gulf War on, Wayne Mesmer. And Mesmer sang it better than anybody. And as the anthem is ending, you can hear three sets of shoes coming up the stairs of the mobile, and there's three NBC executives yelling at the top of their lungs, "We're carrying the anthem tomorrow."
Wow.
So they got the feel for it too. And that to me, in many ways, that was Vincent Damphus's greatest All-Star game. He was so good. But in the end, people remember the anthem more than they remember anything else. It's
funny, I think the Canadian fans, or at least the Leaf fans, remember Damphus, and the anthem was the big thing on the U.S. side.
Absolutely.
Jacques Primo's coverage of Waz last game in Montreal. you describe as brilliant TV, an iconic Hockey Night in Canada moment. Why, to the average person, how can you describe what Jacques Primo did to show and convey the emotion of that night?
Jacques Primo was the best hockey director ever, period. Played the game, understood the game, could speak both languages, lived in Montreal. We brought him to Toronto after the fact, in fact, when I was with the Maple Leafs to direct Maple Leaf games. But that night, this whole line of the relationship between Mario and Patrick and Ronald Corey, Jacques knew that from the moment that Patrick shrugged his shoulders in despair after the 7th goal. And he stuck with it. And it was the simplicity of covering 3 people. There's 18,000 people in the building. There's 40 hockey players, but he covered 3 people. And then the magic of the start of the 3rd period, when the period starts, Ronald Corey's chair is empty.
Right.
And that's the simplicity. I talked about it earlier. Sometimes the greatest stuff can be the simplest stuff.
Right.
And he covered it just so simply. On the English side, the fascination on the English side was that game was seen regionally in the province of Quebec only.
Mm-hmm. I remember.
It wasn't on satellite. It was not on set. It was only on terrestrial television. So there was no satellite. You couldn't sit with your 10-foot dish in those days and watch it in Red Deer.
Right.
But it was, you knew as the night went on, it was the biggest story going. So by the time we had covered it so well, bringing highlights back, bringing tape back, starts of the period, Dick doing a recap. I think there are people in English Canada that really think they watched the whole game live in Montreal. And that to me was one of the most exciting nights of being a storyteller in the game. And because people still talk to me, I remember watching that game. If you lived in Toronto, you did not see that game.
Right.
And you only saw it through our eyes, through our vision of what the intermissions would look like, and everything like that.
Okay, moving on for time's sake. Dave Hodge flips his pen. Canada knows about it, and then he takes a long walk. He goes from 60 Carlton Street to the Weston Harbor Castle, and who does he call?
He calls me. I'm home in Calgary. I've lived in Calgary since 1980. I'm producing Canadian football. I think I'm doing Canadian. Anyway, I'm actually getting ready for the Olympics, working again for Ralph Mellenby. Right. But I had been hired by Global Television to produce their version of the Stanley Cup playoffs under the Carling O'Keefe Brewery banner. Remember, it was in those days it was a brewery war, Molson versus Carling O'Keefe. So I got fired by the Molson guys, got hired by the Carling O'Keefe guys, and so he literally walked down the Weston, picked the phone up, and said, "So, do you need a host?" And I said, "Yes, you're hired." And so I didn't ask anybody else who did it.
Sorry, go ahead.
I said I didn't ask the president of Global. I just said, "Yeah, you're gonna be working for us. Don't worry, you're hired."
And so he knew right as soon as he left the building he was done, right? Because I think some people wonder like what he was thinking after that. But
I think he figured he was done. I think he figured he was done.
Okay, the Insider, a Tim Russert article. An article involving Meet the Press's Tim Russert is handed to you by Ron MacLean. How does that make, or I guess catalyze the unprecedented move? Because I don't think I've seen it in sports of a man going from being a producer and being a head honcho to working in front of the camera.
Yeah, it was the last Stanley Cup final I did for Hockey Night. The Dallas, New Jersey Stanley Cup final. We're flying home on American Airlines, and Ron and Don and I are sitting together in the cabin. And Ron tears out a page, and I think Ron probably had been talking to the people at CBC, and they knew they were going to make a change. Didn't tell me that until August, but he tore it out, and he said, "Here, this is a great story. This is what you should think of doing." And it was a story of Tim Russert, who was the host of Meet the Press and was NBC's political insider, and he had started as a producer for NBC, and 10 years later had migrated to be on the air. And he said, and Ron literally said, "Hey, this should be you. You should be on the air." And by then I knew I was beaten up pretty badly. I was tired. The playoffs always beat you up when you're on the road for 60 days. But I kind of knew my time at CBC was coming to an end. I was hoping it wasn't, but I kind of had a gut feel. It took another 10 years for me to get on the air, but I finally took it to heart. And I still have the article somewhere in a file in my basement.
Well, I mean, excellent. On that note, you then become kind of an insider using all your contacts, and then you're doing this in concert with Elliot Friedman, Chris Johnston. How do you guys as insiders divide up who's going to break what, and is that another producer telling you that, or how does that work? Because you were all getting inside information on the similar subject.
Yeah, although we do have strengths. For instance, I remember Chris saying he's hearing that a player's being traded, but he doesn't know the agent. And I said, "Who's the agent?" And he said, "So-and-so." And I said, "Well, he's one of my best friends, so I'll phone him."
Okay.
So there's a ton of collaboration that exists. And there's a ton of collaboration that exists that somebody who was told information can't really be the one giving it out, because then they would know where the leak is. And so there's a sharing of information there. Both Chris and Elliot do an amazing job of creating. It's all about creating relationships with people, agents, players, managers, coaches, owners, scouts, league presidents, team presidents. That's what it's all about, is building relationships and having the trust of those people to say, "Can you tell me something that I can get out there?" And the person believing that that's the best way to get the news out.
One more question each. Nate, go ahead.
Yeah, in terms of your relationships to sports, John, when you were growing up in British Columbia, you rhymed off to like some pretty big names that you used to pull in on the radio from the west coast of the United States.
Yeah.
Obvious question would be to ask about Vin Scully, since Vin recently left this mortal world. But I wanted to ask with someone who's not as well known, but perhaps should be. What was it like to actually hear Bill King calling games on the radio from Oakland?
Oh, well, and I ended up becoming a Raiders fan because of it as a kid. I loved the Raiders. But Bill King was he was a dynamo. He was so special. He had a great sense of drama. He had that, he didn't have the great voice, Nate. There's a little nasally, but his level of excitement, his level of anticipation, and his descriptive words were just fantastic. I to this day, guys, I still love radio. And it's because of those days that you're talking about, Nate, about, turning on the old Electro Home stereo and seeing if the cloud cover allows us to get, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Portland, and Seattle that day.
From TV to radio to finally the written word, which is, the base of this book. Did you get as a guy working in TV and radio, did you get a new respect for the written word? It's very well written. Did you lean on anyone, any Brunt or anyone, and did you get a new respect, or I guess a more ingrained respect for the ink-stained wretches like Al and Eric Duhatschek and guys that you just wrote for a living?
I don't know how they love it. That's the one thing I will tell you. That's I do respect that. I do have a ton of respect to the editor they gave me, Justin Stoller at Simon & Schuster's. Brilliant.
Right.
He did a magnificent job in coaching me and grilling me on things that I assume people would would know, that I have to learn how to explain in layman's terms. And that's fair, because I do that to hockey players and to announcers when they get too inside. So there's that. I had written enough in my time. Guys like Mike Cormack, when he was at Sportsnet, I had been writing 3 or 4 blogs a week, 900 to 1,000 words a week for the website. That I did understand the written word. I did understand how to do it, but I also wanted to do it in my voice. Mm-hmm. And that was, and they would come back and say, well, people wouldn't normally say things that way. Why do you like doing ... all the time? I like doing ... because that to me indicates a pause. And so I did find a voice that I enjoyed writing in. But I do think it was important that it was my voice and not my words to somebody else to creating a voice.
Thank you for your time today, Mr. Shannon. You gave us a lot of time, and I thank you for that.
Hey, listen, it's the one thing I will tell you guys is that when I read now and they say broadcaster, producer, author, that's kind of cool.
For sure.
That is kind of cool, and nobody can take it away.
Absolutely not. Thank you so much for your time today, John, and I'm sure you got some hockey to watch, and we were very pleased to discuss this book with you, Evolve or Die.
Thanks for taking the time for me, too. Cheers, boys.
Yeah, thank you so much, John.